Welcome to School's Out with Sam Sorbo, a series about education, what you don't know, what you should know, and what to do about it. Last week, our topic was sacrifice, what it really means to sacrifice for your child, and how to sacrifice is in fact to bring a great blessing on yourself, because the reward for your sacrifices is the value they give you, as well as the blessings you bring to your child. So this week, let's dive into virtue. We all know virtue is akin to goodness, but is it still important? And if so, then what? Let's talk definitions. Virtue. I checked first in my trusty old 1828 Webster Dictionary. It says virtue comes from the Latin word virtus, or vireo. So the V in Latin is pronounced w, and this word actually means worth. But this dictionary goes for 10 entries of meanings for this word, which clearly carried great import back then. Strength, bravery, valor, moral goodness, excellence. Then there's also the sense of agency with the word, as in, a man rules by virtue of his office. For our purposes, we are more concerned with the initial definition in this dictionary, which states the radical sense is strength from straining, stretching, extending. This is the primary sense of the word. Particularly holding fast to morals. Marcus Aurelius said, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Therefore, guard accordingly and take care that you entertain no notions unsuitable to virtue and reasonable nature." The Oxford Dictionary on Lexico.com defines virtue as behavior showing high moral standards, or a quality considered morally good or desirable in a person. According to dictionary.reference.com, virtue is, quote, moral excellence, goodness, righteousness, and also conformity of one's life and conduct to moral and ethical principles, uprightness, rectitude. Catholicism lists the 7 heavenly virtues as prudence, justice, temperance, courage or fortitude, faith, hope, and charity. You've probably heard people say patience is a virtue, meaning we all ought to have more of it. It's desirable. This phrase perhaps originates from Cato the Elder's Distichs of Cato, a popular 3rd century Latin text. There's a line that translates as, "Of human virtues, patience is most great." And yet, so many folks casually announce that they have no patience. Some of them even when referring to their own children. As if, I have no patience, and I have no desire to have any, and I'm proud of that. Despite the fact that this is a common phrase that patience is a virtue. Has our culture degraded to the point where, although we still admit that virtues exist, we no longer have need of them? When I was teaching 7th grade to self-learners, I began every class day with a virtuous characteristic like thoughtfulness, determination, or patience. I'd put it on the board and we would workshop it. What does it mean? What does it look like? Why is it important? Are all questions we would explore. I'd write a kind of a word cloud up on the board based on students' contributions. I'd also ask for examples of the word in action so we could really picture it. And finally, it seemed important to consider antonyms. What might the world be like without that word, that virtue? So one day I asked, well, what's the opposite of patience? Immediately, several young teens blurted out, impatience. Well, of course that's true, but it didn't help give us a better sense of the word. It's not great to define a word using the word itself, right? We couldn't figure out a good alternate antonym for patience, so I asked them, well, what does impatience look like? Maybe we can get to it that way. The kids started describing red faces, tapping fingers, and yelling. I looked at them, surprised myself at the revelation. The opposite of patience is anger. Did you ever think about that? If the opposite of patience is anger, well, perhaps there's more reason to pursue the virtue of patience than we otherwise might think. When parents say to me that they lack patience for their children, do they mean they are easily angered or often yell at their children, or what? It ought to be embarrassing when a person loses patience. Has our culture made it admirable? C.S. Lewis said in The Weight of Glory, quote, "If you ask 20 good men of today what they thought the highest of the virtues, 19 of them would reply, unselfishness. But if you had asked any of the great Christians of old, he would have replied, love. You see what has happened? A negative term has been substituted for a positive, and this is of more than philological importance. The negative idea of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not primarily of securing good things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if abstinence and not their happiness were the important point." End quote. In other words, our culture has turned at least one virtue into self-inflicted punishment. Now, a good number of us still pursue virtue, perhaps because we've figured out that the culture is lying to us, that the opposite is the truth. Virtue is its own reward, not a penance. I recently heard a story of a married couple at the therapist's. She was incensed that her husband treated her so poorly, like he didn't respect her at all. And he was annoyed to come home after working all day to his wife's nagging and complaining. The therapist asked her, well, when she had taught the husband to disrespect her. She got all weepy, saying, "Never. I never told him that was okay." The therapist then turned to the husband and asked him, "Well, did you sleep together before you were married?" He was taken aback. "That's not really any of your business." The therapist waved him off, saying, "I'm trying to help you both out here. So please, just humor me." "Fine," the husband says. "Yes, we slept together before we were married. No biggie." "Right," said the therapist. And then, turning to the miserable wife, "That's when you taught him it was okay to disrespect you." You see, there's a reason we have our social mores and traditions. You can get around them, or you can think that you've escaped them, but they are there by and large for good reason. Today's culture of YOLO, or you do you, or live your truth is a lie. Generally, we all can identify good and evil. This moral compass that we have was what C.S. Lewis referred to as the moral law, or the law of right and wrong. So when we break that law, cheat our neighbor, or take what isn't ours, we pay the price in our subconscious. Well, actually, in our conscience, I suppose. We know right and wrong, even as small children. Or they wouldn't insist on what they view as fair. Fairness is a worldwide value. It's the moral law. It's the reason we still value virtue. Pursuing virtue is the purposeful departure from selfishness or being self-serving, which is what evolution would dictate we be. The reason we ought to practice virtue is because it makes us better people, meaning we treat others better. We become better citizens, kinder, more considerate, honest, admirable, good. So when we consider virtue, we ought to ask, can virtue be taught? According to Plato, Meno, an Athenian gentleman, discussed this very subject with Socrates. Can you tell me, Socrates, Meno asked, whether virtue is acquired by teaching or by practice? Or, if neither by teaching nor practice, then whether it comes to man by nature or in what other way? In Plato's book, Meno, a great discussion ensues in which it seems both gentlemen agree that one cannot adequately define virtue well enough to teach it. This seems to have been a feint on the part of Socrates, who held that virtue is the sum of its parts and could not therefore be torn asunder in a tawdry definition. It's kind of an ancient Greek version of, I'll know it when I see it. Today, well, we suffer no such delusions, although we concede that it is impossible to live a completely virtuous life. We define virtue as moral excellence, and we certainly can understand that. So while it's true that some people ascribe to different moralities than others, there is a moral code that pervades U.S. society as a whole, and it is systematized by our laws, which were inspired by the Ten Commandments. The premise of all our laws is freedom for all in harmony with each other as a society. One of the greatest political thinkers of all time was the ancient Roman Marcus Tullius Cicero. Despite the passage of time, his writings have endured and, in fact, acutely informed the founder's vision for the United States of America. Cicero wrote about true law and called it right reason in agreement with nature. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting. It summons to duty by its commands and averts from wrongdoing by its prohibitions. He also calls it right conduct, and the founders liked to refer to it as natural law or the laws of nature and nature's God. You may recognize it as created equal and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, it's completely natural to acknowledge that every person has their right to their life. No one should take that from them, and everyone shall have their liberty or freedom. We live in freedom here in the U.S., and that, in order for freedom to mean anything, each individual is encouraged to pursue his or her own prosperity or happiness, so long as it won't infringe on another's liberty or life. Cicero understood all this way back then. He held that right is based not on a man's opinion, but upon nature. As his life concluded, he recognized that individuals needed to be taught the metric of virtue in order to dislodge the depravity into which society inevitably degrades. In fact, he strongly lamented the fact that depraved men might pass laws that could not possibly be held to be good or just. He wrote, "But if the principles of justice were founded on the decrees of peoples, the edicts of princes, or the decisions of judges, then justice would sanction robbery and adultery and forgery of wills." We know the difference between right and wrong, but virtue is what keeps us attentive to it. We might know something is immoral and do it anyway, whether because we want to or we justify its end result or whatever. But that cannot make it correct. And when we do something improper, We know it. It really doesn't matter if anyone else knows it or not. We know it personally, and we cannot escape that. Incidentally, do you know how you teach a child not to lie? It isn't because it's wrong or it's bad or bad things can happen. All that is not terribly impressive to a young kid living in the moment. And the fear of getting caught only goes so far against the temptation of the rewards from whatever the lie might be. The reason we don't lie, you tell the child, is because you may be the only one who ever finds out. You may succeed in your lie, but you will know. And so every time you look in the mirror, you know you are looking at a liar. You know the person looking back at you cannot be trusted. And there's one person in this whole world whose trust you need desperately, and that's you. You need to be able to trust you. It's pretty much a similar argument with the virtues, actually. Last week, we talked about sacrifice, and I mentioned that every decision involves a sacrifice. It's just a choice of what one surrenders. I discussed running toward sacrificing for your child or children because ultimately there is tremendous reward in acting thusly. So it's not really a sacrifice after all, right? Virtue has similar properties. It's reflexive, like sacrifice. So we don't compromise our integrity or virtue, because by retaining virtue, we maintain our honor. But by surrendering to temptation, we forfeit our valuable honor. Where does that leave us with our children? First of all, in order to have a just society, we need to be law-abiding. Of course, the laws must be just, or they be not laws. But by living in this nation, we have tacitly agreed to living within the laws or moral code of the nation. That's called behaving in a virtuous manner. So now the question is not whether virtue can be taught, because it must be taught or we will lose our society. So, taught how? Where? By whom? Oh, there's the rub. Long ago, some people conceived that public schools would be the place children learned morality, to behave with virtue and become upstanding citizens of the nation. And then we took the 10 Commandments out of the schools, and education became more about instilling knowledge than forming whole young people of good character, as if children were simply little widgets and were naturally good. Sorry. Who came up with that plan, by the way? That sticking a bunch of fourth graders together in a classroom all day would result in them learning good things from each other. Whoever thought that needs his head examined. So, how are children to learn virtue? Certainly not in the school classroom anymore, where morals are verboten. But teachers may instruct children almost however they prefer. You know, it's only the ones that get called out that may be made examples of. And I know there are a lot of good teachers, most of them probably. But those are the ones abiding by the rules and not teaching their morals, their biblical morals, to their students. Whereas the competition, the teachers who want to generate little Marxists or Antifa activists, they have no problem bringing that instruction into the classroom, as we just saw with the teacher recently suspended for offering advanced placement credit to students for participating in Antifa rallies, and the other teacher suspended for encouraging her class to say the United States Pledge of Allegiance to the gay pride flag after she removed the U.S. flag from her classroom. She thought this was hilarious, by the way, from her giggling video post on social media. Here's the main point. Without morals, there's no common value system. And without a value system, there's no meaning. And if there's no meaning, life has no purpose, which is where our children find themselves today, having been taught that life originated as a series of accidents and that there is no morality but whatever works for you, i.e., live your truth and YOLO, or you only live once. And we wonder why teen suicide is rising. That's even before COVID. And why there seems to be more and more violence in our schools and more restrictions placed on the children in them. Some of our schools literally look like prisons. Giving a child an education without any moral framework just makes him a better criminal. But giving a child an education in virtue stokes the child's innate sense of morality and provokes in him or her a penchant for being a better person. As Thomas Aquinas said, happiness is secured through virtue. It is a good attained by man's own will. Finally, the way we teach our children virtue is by having discussions with them on all things virtuous and not. To that end, I wrote my book, Teach from Love. In the book, I cover over 70 characteristics we ought to encourage in our children with short little illustrative stories and questions to encourage conversation. Children crave the exchange, particularly with adults, on things that matter. So rather than giving your children the pablum offered in our K-12 debacle of public school, give them something substantive. Challenge them with ethical dilemmas like finding a wallet with money in it. What should you do about that? Or getting extra change at the grocery store. Keep it or return it. And consider the people losing that money, the owner of the wallet or the checkout gal who then loses her job. You see, virtue is tied to love for our fellow man, and love is yoked with happiness. For teenagers, have the difficult conversations about relationships and marriage. Even if you did things the wrong way, if you know better now. We want our children to be, above all, happy people, right? Teach them virtue to launch them in the right direction. And use that time to build your relationship with your child. Cultivate it. And let it cultivate you as well. Be virtuous for your child. On this show, we've talked about redefining education, parental insecurities, about self-teaching and the self-teaching paradigm, sacrifice, and virtue. Next episode, we delve into autonomy, taking charge as the parent, because self-teaching is just as much about parenting as it is about knowledge. Maybe even more. Virtue isn't something one can lecture. It must be investigated, reasoned, gathered, pondered, and considered, and it's best explored in relationship with others. Children with parents, and parents with their children. But there are some ground rules for the roles in that equation, so that's next week's project. As always, thanks for joining me for another episode of School's Out with Sam Sorbo.